So, good morning, everyone. Thank you, Susan, Ricardo, and Mucho, for being with us today. I'm very excited to be moderating the first panel of the day. And it'll be very insightful to hear from our panelists who come from different parts of the capital spectrum, from commercial capital to multilateral to philanthropic capital. As backdrop, we heard many times in yesterday's program how climate financing, is crucial for energy transition. It's crucial for the development of more green infrastructure that's very much needed in the region. But in the current environment, climate financing is also more challenging, right? The world is grappling with geopolitical tensions, with economic headwinds. Governments are facing tight fiscal budgets, competing priorities. Some have pulled back from their climate commitments. But despite these challenges, the need and the urgency for climate action has only increased, especially in Asia, where the impacts of climate change has been very tangible. So in this panel, I would like to invite our speakers to share their views about how institutions from different parts of the capital spectrum can work together to achieve our climate goals, what they're seeing in the markets that's interesting in today's environment, and lastly, how do we use tools like blended finance to help bridge some of the financing gap? With that context, I'll start by maybe inviting our speakers to comment around the appetite in the current environment for climate financing. Maybe starting with you, Ricardo, just thinking about many competing development priorities, how does IFC and also your government stakeholders think about deployment of capital towards climate financing?
Thank you very much, Connie, and good morning to everybody. I was looking at one piece of data this morning. In 2024, Asia and Pacific invested $1 trillion in investment in energy transition investment, which is more or less half of the global investment worldwide. But that's 2024. Now we're in 2025. The ecosystem is very different. There is far more uncertainty, and uncertainty doesn't help long-term investment. Capital expenditures make it far more difficult. So this is where we live now. I think the demand for energy transition financing is still there, but there is this big level of uncertainty. What can the World Bank Group and IFC do? IFC can take more risk. We can and must take more risk in our investment. For example, doing more equity, doing more junior equity, mezzanine, giving more insurances together with MIGA in order to make sure that other investors feel more comfortable in investing in energy transition financing. And in addition, together with our brothers and sisters at the World Bank, it is very important that we help developing legal regulatory policy frameworks. We help developing taxonomies that help to show transparency and integrity in the kind of investments that can be done. Last but not least, working with partners is fundamental. It is not only about financial risk. And I would like to repeat that we plan to take more credit risk, more financial risk to foster investments from all kinds of partners. But it is very important that we don't do this alone. We do it together with philanthropic capital. We do it together with commercial banks. We do it together with funds, with financial intermediaries. I think that if we want to keep the kind of investment level needed to address this issue, we have to work it all together. Maybe the last word, I have to say, I'm very happy to see that in Asia and Pacific, to see that the willingness to address the issue of the energy transition is still very relevant, and it's very, very good. And it's very good about not only the usual investment in renewables, and energy and electric vehicles and all the rest, but also grids and country cooperation. So very relieved about that.
Okay, maybe Susan, you can share with us, as a commercial asset manager, have you observed any changes in terms of your clients' appetite for climate-related investments and financing?
Thank you, Connie. Okay, everybody can hear me. Good morning. So to your question, has this slowed down? I don't think so. As Pussy just said, 1 trillion in Asia, that's 2 trillion globally in 2024. Our belief is that this is going to double and accelerate by 2030 to 4 trillion. And just at BlackRock alone, we set out on a journey around 2018, building our sustainable investment capabilities. And in 2018, we had put a target to achieve 1 trillion in investable dollars by 2030. We achieved this last year. So if anything, it's accelerating. What I would say though is that it's taking different forms, different shape, and different speed depending on the country and depending on who you're speaking to. And I think while the theme is unanimous and it's global, depending on countries, and we just saw this in what the minister in Malaysia said, you know, different countries, different regions will focus on different things. And we're seeing this across the region. In China, China's focusing on EV, on battery, on storage. ASEAN, as Minister Ahmed just said, is about grid. India also is focusing on transmission and grid. And this will consume different needs, it will consume different capitals, and it will absolutely require all the participants and this ecosystem to continue to develop.
Thanks, Susan. Wu Chong, I mean, philanthropic capital is always a scarce resource, even in good times. Have you noticed any changes in terms of your donors' commitments or priorities?
Thank you very much for having us here. First of all, I'm so happy to be here, to have to participate in this incredible event. It's so important now more than ever that we get together to talk about how we can navigate this. Philanthropy space is quite active, and if you look at my favorite, my best friend these days, ChatGPT, I decided to look up how much money was floating around from the philanthropy space in the US alone last year. And they talk about $500 billion. But where do you see this? You don't actually see a huge impact on things like climate change because people are working alone. And I think that's one of the things that needs to change, not just within philanthropies, but across different sectors, the multilaterals, private sector. I do feel like I'm a hybrid because I'm philanthropy now, but I came from the Asian Development Bank. We all have to work together because the scarce philanthropy money is very, very flexible. And we have to make sure that we use our resources in a way that we can leverage Ricardo's money and Susan's money in a much bigger way. And that's how we can go from millions to billions to trillions, because billions is not enough. MDBs all combined, it's going to be in the billions. And the other factor is no matter who's in which government, it actually doesn't matter. If you look at the statistics, the business will drive it. And renewable energy has made that turn so that you can actually continue to push and have business to be profitable. And President Trump's now there, but when he was there last time, the renewable energy investment went up by 65%. So as long as we make this investments attractive for private sector, so that people can actually profit from it, it will work. Especially in the renewable energy space, it's a long-term sustainability. So I expect optimism to continue in this space.
It's really good to hear there's still very much active interest and strong commitment to climate financing. Maybe we move into looking at what kind of opportunities are you seeing that are most interesting. Maybe Susan, you can start us off with that.
Sure. So when we talk about any energy transition, if we think about the what already has been spoken about, it's about battery, it's about storage, it's about clean energy, it's about panels, farms, wind farms. So infrastructure is going to play a key role in how we create this future. So we, for sure, see a lot of tremendous opportunities in infrastructure, and you're going to hear from one of our colleagues from GIP later on, so I won't steal Annika's thunder, but so that's a piece of it. But really across, I would say, public markets, in terms of investing into active equities through to private markets, we are seeing this investment being incredibly, incredibly important. And then also the financing. You know, the financing piece of this is going to become more and more important because financing is not infinite. Financing is a finite resource for everything that we do, not just in transition, but everything. And what I would say is that the greatest need right now is to create an ecosystem where we can bring both public and private capital into the mix. So we see huge opportunities in the financing space as well.
Great, thanks, Susan. Woo-Chung, Asia is still very much largely dependent on fossil fuel, and this energy transition will be very important, which is right at the heart of GEOP's mandate. What do you see as the opportunity to make an impact in Asia?
Yeah, so Susan just talked about public-private partnership,
Yeah.
which I used to be quite active in the past.
Yeah.
Now we're talking about 4Ps, public, private, and philanthropy partnerships, so we can again work together. And this region, there is quite a dominance in fossil fuel, but that's why the GEOP is working on helping the countries achieve greening of the grid. So how do we actually make a difference? How do you attract more capital to do what we need to do? So I looked at Africa. I was going to think what I'm going to talk about. We have this collaboration in Africa called the Mission 300, which I'm sure Ricardo knows about. It's about electrifying 300 million people with hopefully green energy. And that's going to mobilize $100 billion. And that has World Bank, IFC, AFDB, and then all the private capitals. And even the IMF is part of that program. And philanthropy is in there. So we can work with the big guns to take that position that they cannot take. So I know Ricardo is trying really hard to be innovative and push from everybody, but also his own inspiration to be more risk-taking. But the system doesn't allow him to go to certain things, if it's really, really frontier technology or region. We can, but from our perspective, we can't just take the position unless we know that there will be financing coming in because of our triggering event. So the thing that we are trying to do is look at every opportunity to see how we can make that action to trigger others to come in. So in Southeast Asia, the Minister of Environment from Malaysia talked about so I was thinking, what can we do in Asia that's similar to Mission 300 in a scale of PPP collaboration? And I think I just found it, the ASEAN Power Grid, because that's really complicated, first of all, so no one's going to want to do it alone. It's going to require a lot of collaboration, coordination, and huge amounts of investment. So I know there's lots of communication that's happening. We actually haven't really dove into that, but this sounds like something that the leadership should embrace and tell the technical people to go get it done. Because that's when you have some ambitious programs to launch, you need that very, very senior level buy-in, and let the technical people figure out how to get there. And I hope they can get more engaged in that program.
Yes, that would be very impactful. Ricardo, what about the IFC? How are you thinking about market opportunities?
But listen, in terms of sectors, I would say even in renewables, I would say renewables in more advanced markets where regulation is very clear is very much commoditized. So I think there are very many opportunities where probably we are not needed. but we are certainly needed even in renewables where there is the legal and regulatory framework is not enough developed. One example is actually what we are doing in the context of the FASP, together with MAS, together with Temasek, HSBC, and other partners, to go into marginally bankable projects. So to be able to show that we can take more risk in order to advance these projects and have more financing available. Always in terms of sectors, certainly electric vehicles are there, batteries are there. But I have to say, I also agree that energy transportation, especially regional energy transportation, is key. It avoids the doubling up of investments in generation and allows for energy to be traded. And probably, in my opinion, will really provide the most affordable, the most competitive, secure, and clean energy. So, I mean, I think this is where we will certainly go. I already talked to the governments involved. IFC will be happy to provide equity in these very large regional transportation power grids. Certainly is very important. Let's not forget other small things that are small but important. Hard to abate sector, we need to go there. We need to be in the energy efficiency of buildings and in energy of efficiency in many other activities. But I think there are opportunities, and there are opportunities for all kind, for all level of risk that want to invest in energy transition in Asia.
Yeah, I just want to pick up on a point that actually all of you mentioned around partnership and the importance of bringing together the ecosystem. I know the World Bank and the IFC have been quite active in engaging with private sector leaders in the Private Sector Investment Lab, really to try to develop solutions to address the barriers to private sector investments in emerging markets. Ricardo, are there any initiatives coming out of the lab that could help mobilize more private sector capital in Asia?
Absolutely, there are many initiatives. For those of you who are less familiar with the Private Sector Investment Lab, this is a group of senior executives from finance and from industry, from the private sector, that convene under the hosting of the World Bank Group to discuss how we can invest more, what more can be done to attract and retain private sector investments in many countries, including in Asia. I would say what has come out is very, very good. Actually, when I talk about taking more risk in equity, doing more junior equity, mezzanine, and first less equity, is something that comes out from the PSIL, as well as, if you want, insurance. This is very important. It's very important that the one part of the World Bank Group, because this is a World Bank Group effort, is able to ensure that the legal and regulatory framework is so stable, is so comfortable, that payments to be done to the private sector in PPPs are going to be insured by the World Bank Group and by its balance sheet. It's very important. I would say then the work on local currency, local capital markets. Let's not forget that many of energy infrastructure are actually local projects, and I would say water infrastructure or many other projects like this. So it's very important to develop local currency solutions, local capital markets, and last but not least, and I will never stop saying this, the most important thing is a sustainable and predictable legal policy and regulatory framework. This is the real, if you want, de-risking instrument. Is make sure that the private investors are comfortable with the choices that have been made and that they're not going to face change in regulations quickly or suddenly that put not only the money at risk, put credibility at risk. And credibility is far more important than money.
Yeah, it's very encouraging to hear there's a lot of opportunities that you see in the market, as well as really tangible ideas that you have to kind of accelerate this climate actions. I mean, one topic I want to dive into is around blended finance. We've heard the word mentioned a lot of times in the program, and it's gained a lot of traction over the past few years in terms of trying to mobilize more commercial capital. And you all have a lot of experience with blended finance, each of you playing a different role in the capital stack. So wanted to hear your views in terms of what you think works well, what hasn't worked so well. Maybe I can invite Wu Chong to start off. You know, what has GEOP's experience been, perhaps in a recent example of something that you're involved in that involves blended finance?
Yeah, thank you. There are many examples that we are working on. As I think everyone knows about the Southeast Asia Clean Energy Fund, and then the ETAF. But I want to briefly talk about this project in Indonesia, Cirebon, the coal shutdown project, which is actively being pursued. It's rolling back a couple of years ago, or maybe 18 months ago. This is a very complex project, almost $500 million deal, where we need to restructure the whole PPA to reduce the life of the power plant by about 7-8 years. So that deal, actually, I was in the ADB side when it started, and now I'm on the GEOP side. And it required multi-stakeholder collaboration, the government, the project sponsors, the bankers, and of course the philanthropies. And when I was on the other side, I was trying to convince the GEOP to join. And I'm glad we did, because the amount that philanthropy came in with for that one was quite small. For about $500 million deal, we are going in with like a $5 million equity and about $10 to $15 million grant to help buy down the cost of the investment, and also basically by de-risking it. And if you look at from every stakeholder's perspective, it is a risky deal. What if it doesn't work? From the MDB space, the mission leader, he or she is driven by making the deal happen. And as the reality sets in, it's still work in progress. Hopefully we'll get there. I heard some positive news about it. But the fact that we are doing it, it's going to have so many lessons to learn from and be able to come up with something even better in the future. So, the Prime Minister of Canada, Mark Carney, even he had a role in that one because he was the chair of the GFANS at the time. And 18 months ago, I remember meeting him with our president in ADB, where some of the banks were a bit hesitant at the technical level because of the perceived profitability, where they might not make as much money. So we had this conversation, and I don't actually know whether he spoke to the leaders, but something happened. Within 2 weeks, people turned around and actually came up with a deal that actually worked. So this brings this kind of silly analogy that I came up with. Last month, my father, who was 97 years old, he just passed away. So it makes me always think about him when I talk about challenging things. And I realize I'm turning into my father, actually, because I find myself watching Animal Kingdom on weekends. And I gravitate towards videos about animals chasing to eat other animals. And I still remember this one particular film clip where there were like hundreds of gazelles next to water, and there are lions coming from one side. So that's when they get there, they're going to die, right? Most of them. So the only way to survive is to cross the river, but the river was infested with crocodiles. So they're all hesitating, and all of a sudden, this one brave gazelle jumps in, miraculously stumbles over these crocodiles and makes it over. Then all of the gazelles jumped in, and most of them made it over. A few got killed. So that made me think, hey, that's climate change. The lions are the climate change. It's coming. Unless you take community-based collective action, you're going to surely die. So one brave soul went in and made it. So if you're actually working in tandem, there's some real risk that you might actually die. But everybody else who made it through, they lived through a perceived risk, right? So I was thinking, this I was watching when I was just coming over to Jeff, and I said, I want to be that gazelle that jumped in. Whether he or she jumped on his own or he got pushed in by somebody, but the fact is you've made it, and this lesson that if you work together, the real risk is actually very, very small. But still, those dead gazelles are important because you do need to deal with the real risk too, right? So you have to minimize that. So the message for all of us is commercial banks, the MDBs, philanthropies, and CSO. We all have to work collectively so that we can all get to the other side, away from the climate change.
Yeah, it's a very interesting analogy. I just want to ask maybe a follow-up question, because when we think about blended finance, often the most difficult is the concessional piece. As philanthropic capital, how do you think about what projects to take on to use your kind of limited resources?
Yeah, I kind of answered that earlier, but just to elaborate a little bit, there's quite a bit of philanthropic capital, but what I find is a lot of the intervention happen in silo, so it never scaled. So what I'm trying to do is bring everybody together and look for opportunities where we can demonstrate and bring that risk, especially the perceived risk, so that MDBs and the private sector can come in. So it's a moot point if you just do one little pilot and there's no vision for scale up, right? So we have to use our precious flexible capital in a capital stack where nobody else can take, so we can actually demonstrate that the deal would work, so that others with a larger amount of resources can come in and scale up, and then we go to the next one to look for additional demonstration.
Susan, what about BlackRock? You've been involved with quite a few blended finance initiatives, FastP, Climate Finance Partners, Altera. What do you think blended finance is most effective in solving? And then on the flip side, what do you see as the limitations?
So I do agree that in terms of the positive is bringing together all the partners. And I do commend Singapore for FastP efforts and how we're participating. It's only with all the partners that we can truly mobilize and to make impact. Let me just focus on where we can potentially work to improve. If we think about this ecosystem, BlackRock as a fiduciary always focuses on what our clients' needs are. And in order for us to think about how to service them globally, we're always thinking about scale. And one of the most important things, irrespective of asset class, has always been about how do we scale by growing the ecosystem? How do we scale by providing transparency so that our clients can assess the risk that they are putting their capital to work in? And when we think about blended finance and when we think about the transition, I would say one of the main areas is around origination that can improve. Today, the ecosystem is still relatively operating as it always have. Big asset owners, banks. We need to improve and increase that ecosystem to bring in more so that we can bring in the corporates, we can bring in the insurers, we can bring in large-size family offices into the equation so that that ecosystem brings more of the capital that is actually today sitting on the sideline. There is an incredible amount of dry powder capital sitting in the system that's looking for a place to go. Where they deploy that capital will be critically important in terms of the transparency that we can offer, how they can assess the risk of their investments, and ultimately generate the returns that they're helping for. I think the other piece is, and Ricardo touched upon that, regulation. And we see this. My view, our view, there's nowhere than insurance where it is a marriage made in heaven because of the long-term approach that insurance companies need to take for their balance sheet. There, we actually need regulation to help them so that they have capital relief, so that there is look-through, so that they can focus on investing for the long term into areas like infrastructure, to help in the energy transition.
Yep. Ricardo, how about you? How does IFC think about blended finance as a potential solution?
But listen, historically, IFC has mobilized $8 of commercial bank financing for every dollar of blended finance. But I think we live in a different environment now. We live in an environment where blended finance is becoming more difficult to get. I mean, usual donors, many countries are now distracted by extremely important questions. So I don't think how much we see of it. So it is really necessary that we optimize the use of blended finance and we scale it up as much as we can. I have to say, I've never liked the word de-risking because I don't think there is anything like de-risking. I think there is something which is about risk allocation. Risk is there, but it must be divided in a way which is fair. I think if we want to attract more blended finance, if we want to have it more effective, more efficient, we have to devise a system where it is extremely transparent to show how this blended finance is done. It's not used to reduce the risk of the private sector in a kind of unfair way. It is used to attract private sector that would not go to projects. So it's very important to show what is the additionality of blended finance. But I think that it is really very important that we develop this as much as we can and we show what are the data, what are the environment under which blended finance is used. I think this way we can attract far more.
Yeah, what I'm hearing is that blended finance is a useful tool. We can probably scale it more, make it more effective because it is a very scarce resource. In terms of the concessional capital, we need transparency, we need the data, and we need to establish a blueprint, as Wu Chong was saying, a blueprint for kind of future replicability, as well as demonstrating that the perceived risk may not be as actually, the actual risk is not as high as the perceived risk. So thanks for those insights. And I think we only have a few minutes left. So before we wrap up the panel, maybe I'd like to invite our panelists to just share maybe one thing, one action you think the financial sector can do collectively to help bridge the climate financing gap.
I'll say it again. Data and transparency is going to be key to unlocking the dollars that will get deployed and invested.
Yeah, I would agree with Susan. I think taxonomy is key. Having a clear taxonomy, avoid to be again in a problem of not being clear, not being transparent. And I would say also education. It is necessary to educate institutional investors of all kind, on what can be achieved through financial instruments, especially through capital markets.
Financial market, and I'm not going to pretend to be an expert in front of the BlackRock and IFC, but philanthropy can add a huge value. And in fact, yesterday I learned in one of the Philanthropy Asia Summit meetings, question about is Asian philanthropy is active enough in Asia? We don't think that's true, but it's not showing enough, right? So we have to do something. And one of the panelists actually mentioned, which I'm going to use over and over again, that Asian philanthropies should be like an acupuncture. You have a very small needle, right? It's not a big stick, but you can fix pains with a very, very focused intervention, pinpointing at the right pain points. So we want to be the needle, and they can tell us where the pain points are, and we'll go there and fix it, so that they can actually we can function as a whole body. So next time when we come back, I hope you invite me again to Ecosperity, that we can talk about how we are curing people using the acupuncture of Asia.
That's great. Now I know where to go if I need an analogy. Yeah. Well, thank you very much for sharing your very insightful views about how we can help bring partnerships together to address climate change. Thank you very much.